Very, got it. Okay. I'm here actually with part of my gender food rights class, where we read this week, among other things, Joy Cox's really exciting transformation or assimilation full figure fashion piece. And we're looking forward to a very exciting discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you so much, Ani. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Esther Rothblum. Esther Rothblum, PhD, is Professor Emerita of Women's Studies at San Diego State University and editor of Fat Studies, an interdisciplinary journal of body, weight, and society. And at this point, I want to just add that I have read that journal since it began publishing. I've been a reviewer for it, and I think it's extraordinary. It fills a niche that there's nothing else that fills that niche in the academic world. So thank you for that. Dr. Rothblum's research and writing have focused on the stigma of weight, weight and employment discrimination, and weight against cultures. She has edited over 20 books, including Overcoming Fear of Fat with Laura Brown in 1989. Her book, The Fat Studies Reader, with Sandra Solovey in 2009, was reviewed in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Ms. Magazine, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, among others, and received the Susan Koppelman Award for Best Anthology by the Popular Culture American Culture Association, and a Distinguished Publication Award from the Association for Women in Psychology. Esther Rothblum is a member of the advisory board of the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance and a founding co-chair of the Size Acceptance Caucus of the Association for Women in Psychology. She was also the founding director of the LGBTQ+ Studies program at San Diego State University, the editor of the Journal of Lesbian Studies, and conducts research on same-sex couples and on LGBTQ+ mental health. Welcome, Dr. Rothblum.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Brown, and I'm really delighted that Syracuse University is foregrounding critical fat studies. I think you are a leader in the world in that regard. What I would like to do now is share my screen, and oh good, I think hopefully you can see that here. And now it always takes a moment till I can start the slide show, because the screen share thing covers this up. Let's see if I can get rid of that.
I think if you click from beginning at the far left on the top, that should do it.
There we go. Whoops, I'm going to go up page. Here we go. Thank you to those people who are techno wizards. Okay, so I just wanted to begin with some terminology, which I think many of you may be familiar with. And that is that in the US, in English, many medical terms are based on Greek and Latin. If you think of any illness, disease, medical procedure, they're usually a Greek or Latin word. And so what happens when groups organize is they often take the original word, like homosexual, and replace it with something shorter and more informal, like gay. And sometimes they even recreate or reuse a word that has been used against them, like queer. And so similarly, the word obesity is based on Greek. And as groups organized, they began to reclaim the word fat. And so in the Fat Studies journal, we always put the term obese or obesity into quotation marks, and we prefer fat. I also want to point out that the words overweight, underweight, and normal weight assume that there is this normal weight that everybody would be at if they ate the same and exercised the same. And that is just not true. If you took 100 babies, gave them all the same amount of food and same amount of exercise, you know they would grow up to have very different body sizes. So I'm going to be using the term fat. So fat studies, in our introduction to the fat studies reader, we defined as in the tradition of critical race studies, queer studies, and women's studies, fat studies is an interdisciplinary field of scholarship marked by an aggressive, consistent, rigorous critique of the negative assumptions, stereotypes, and stigma placed on fat and the fat body. And in this field, it advocates respectful treatment of people regardless of size. It asks why we oppress people who are fat and who benefits from that oppression, which I think is very interesting, and argue that weight, like height, is a human characteristic that varies across any population. So in that regard, fat studies resembles other academic disciplines that question discriminatory practices based on race, ethnicity, gender, age, and so on. So what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of the academic part of fat studies, the history of fat, the intersection of fat with gender, race, income, and sexuality. And I'm going to try to focus on the questions I always get asked, but aren't they unhealthy and why can't they just lose weight? And then I'll end with publishing in the field of fat studies. So I'll talk a little bit about my own research on weight and stigma, the anthology, the Fat Studies Reader, and other work by fat studies scholars. What got me interested in fat studies was back in 1983, I was at a conference and the performance group Fat Lip Readers Theater was performing. And I had been told by well-meaning colleagues not to study what was then called weight stigma. People said you'll never get a job and, you know, it's, but aren't they unhealthy, that kind of thing. And so when I heard this group perform, I knew this was going to be a big part of my life. And much later, they put out a VHS tape called Nothing to Lose. And so they, I think to some degree, are still around. I just want to point out that this is not a new field. And so I'm going to show you sort of what was around in the 1980s in what is now called fat studies. There was a book called Shadow on a Tightrope, Writings by Women on Fat Oppression, The Fat Black Woman's Poems, Transforming Body Image, Learning to Love the Body You Have, The Dieter's Dilemma, Why Diets Are Obsolete, The New Set Point Theory of Weight Control. So these were some of the early books that I remember reading. I was also very influenced by the work of Susan and Wayne Woolley, who were at the University of Cincinnati Medical School. And I point this out because some of the earliest research on fat studies came out of health and medicine, which might seem counterintuitive, but often it was medical professionals who got it that people were not losing weight. You could lose weight, but you would put it back on, and that there were a lot of problems with the so-called health risks related to weight. I also want to put this in larger context that very much fat studies is a field that affects women, although of course it also affects men and children. In 1986, Susan Brownmiller wrote a book called Femininity. And in this book, she argues that across historical time and across the world, there have always been ways that women are supposed to look like and act like. And so if you look at old drawings and more recently old photographs, you know, women look very different across culture, but there are some similarities. And some of these are on this slide and the next one. She says that women are expected to look and dress in ways that immobilize them. And these constricting norms are thought to be the invention of women themselves. So whether this is wearing high heels or corsets, things like that. And without conformity to these norms, women cannot marry or function in society. And the fashion exaggerates the smallness of a feature that is already smaller in women than in men. So women typically have smaller feet than men, and yet they're supposed to have, you know, very tight shoes or high heels. Women typically have smaller waists than men, and yet are supposed to wear corsets. And also women typically weigh less than men. And the medical establishment endorses the practice as health promoting, while at the same time treating large numbers of women for medical complications resulting from the practice. And so hopefully you can also see how weight fits into these characteristics as well. Also, I want to mention Mary Daly, who was a feminist theologian, and among her numerous books, she wrote a book in 1984 called Pure Lust, Elemental Feminist Philosophy. And she talks about what she called plastic and potted passions. Plastic passions are things we are not born loving, but we are told have high status, like certain clothing designers, for example. And potted passions refer to the fact that women are allowed to do things in very, very small spheres. So if you put a plant in a very small flower pot, it cannot grow any larger than that flower pot. It's kind of constricted. And so I want to give you an example of what I see, how I see Mary Daly's work being applied. Here is a book that was reviewed in the New York Times Book Review in 2008, and it was called The Day I Ate Whatever I Wanted. And on the back cover, it says, what would you do if you could do whatever you wanted for just one day? Every now and then, don't you wish you could do something impulsive, like eat an entire pint of ice cream, or call an old flame out of the blue, or tell your mom what you really think? In The Day I Ate Whatever I Wanted, women are rebelling, kicking up their heels, and finally breaking free. Now, first of all, notice the book is called The Day I Ate Whatever I Wanted, not the month or the rest of my life. And what do you do if you can do whatever you want? You eat a pint of ice cream and yell at your mother. This is a great example of potted passions. Do you do something about anti-war activism? Do you dismantle the patriarchy? No, you focus on a very small thing. That is what women are allowed to do. Also in the 1980s, Kim Chernin wrote a book called The Obsession, Reflections on the Tyranny of Slenderness. And she has this quote, in this era when inflation has assumed alarming proportions and the threat of nuclear war has become a serious danger, when violent crime is on the increase and unemployment a persistent social fact, 500 people are asked by the pollsters what they fear most in the world, and 190 of them answer that their greatest fear is getting fat. I just want to say that normally at this point, I would say to students, you know, in the 1980s, the threat of nuclear war was very real, and it's not so large now. But unfortunately, right now, again, if you read the news today, you know, this is again becoming an alarming issue. So let me talk about the history of fat. And some of you may be familiar with these figurines, especially the one on the left, the Venus of Willendorf. These figures have been found around Eastern Europe. They're tiny, they're just a few inches in height, and they seem to have some commonalities. They have large breasts and buttocks and thighs and stomachs. They don't seem to have a face. It's not really clear what they are for. But obviously, if they were made, they probably had some kind of positive features like fertility or beauty. They're called goddess figures, but obviously nobody knows really what their use was. But you can see they go back a very long time. More recently in the US, Laura Fraser in the Fat Studies Reader wrote about the fact that from the 1880s to the 1920s, in the US, the image of fat as pleasant and prosperous began to change. People had to do less to produce food. The US economy switched from being mostly agricultural to being mostly industrial. And there was a huge wave of immigration, and people of Northern European descent, who tended to be taller and thinner, wanted to distinguish themselves physically and racially from immigrants who tended to be from Southern Europe and therefore shorter and heavier. Thinness was a sign of morality, and the medical profession switched with great difficulty from advocating weight gain to advocating weight loss. So again, this is kind of a more recent historical trend. Now, the 1960s, which usually refers to 1968 to 1972, was a time of liberation movements, particularly the civil rights movement. And out of that came the gay liberation movement, the women's liberation movement, and so on. And so Bill Fabry in 1969 founded the NAFA, or the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, which still exists. There was also a group of women in Los Angeles who formed the Fat Underground. And on the right, you can see Judy Free Spirit, one of the members. And they wrote what they called a Fat Liberation Manifesto, written by Judy Freespirit and Aldebaran in 1973, which was based on the Communist Manifesto and had the phrase, "Fat people of the world unite, you have nothing to lose." Currently, and this should not be a surprise to anyone, there is a tremendous obsession with thinness in Western nations, especially for girls and women. There's a rise in eating disorders. And this is a really interesting area to me because if you are studying racism or sexism or ageism, people are reluctant to say they are racist, sexist, or ageist, even on anonymous questionnaires, but they will tell you they hate fat people. In other words, it's still an area where it is in many areas appropriate to discriminate quite openly rather than in a more coded way. I also want to bring this up for those of you who are interested in popular culture. Take a look at these quotes. Somewhere along the way, Americans have supersized ourselves into becoming the fattest nation on earth. Australia has become the fattest nation in the world with more than 9 million adults now rated as obese or overweight, according to an alarming new report. Canadian adults, both men and women, are the most obese in a survey of 63 nations that raises new health warnings for our country. Fat German citizens, the fattest in the European Union. Now heavyweight Brits are the fattest people in Europe. South Africans among world's fattest people, survey finds. Mexico overtakes United States as world's fattest country. Malaysia, over the past 3 decades, this increasingly prosperous nation has become the fattest country in Asia, with nearly half the adult population now overweight or obese. What's going on here? All these countries bragging they are the fattest. Well, I think that, news sources like to say something that gathers attention. So it's not kind of boring to say we are the 12th fattest or the 20th fattest. And so the news tends to do things that are alarmist or that show us to be really good or really bad. Now, you may be wondering which of these countries is the fattest, by the way, and the answer is none of them. The international data on weight collected by the World Health Organization, this is the most recent data I could find. Most of the countries that have the highest levels of body mass index or BMI are Pacific Island nations like Samoa, Micronesia, etc. These countries have very small populations. They are not consumer markets in the global sphere. And so that's why the news media typically ignores them. I also want to point out that the US likes to fight wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. There's a war on cancer. And so in 1995, the Surgeon General at the time declared war on obesity. And again, it's important to follow the money. This was funded by a number of weight dieting companies. Now, in the US, weight rose in the US in the 1990s. You can see some of the data here. But in the first decade of 2000, it remained the same. This is an article from the Journal of the American Medical Association by Catherine Flagel, who works for the Centers for Disease Control. And really, the weight for boys, girls, men, and women was really pretty much the same in all the graphs. I haven't yet seen the data for the second decade of this century. What is usually not mentioned when people talk about changing weights is that we are living so much longer. Here's the life expectancy for people born in 1930 versus 2019. You can see that we are outliving our grandparents by almost 20 years or a whole generation. And actually, again, if you're interested in popular culture, take a look at how the media covers this. So here are 2 examples from the San Francisco Chronicle, just a year apart. The first one was an article on the epidemic of obesity. You see this a lot. And they have this quote: some 40 to 50% of food eaten by kids is consumed at school, and school cafeterias often offer prepackaged, unhealthy food. A year earlier, the San Francisco Chronicle had an article about Americans are living longer, need more services. The number of Americans at least 90 years old has tripled in recent decades. People are living longer for a variety of reasons, with better and more available medical care and improved nutrition topping the list. So when it's about obesity, we have poor nutrition. When it's about longevity, we have great nutrition. And you never see these 2 articles together, right? Another thing I need to mention, this I think is very, very important, that in the US, there is a strong relationship, and this is also true in many Western countries, between weight and income. Poor people are fat and rich people are thin. If I ask students why this is, they always say, I'm not even going to ask the audience this, they'll say something like, poor people can't afford organic fruits and vegetables, macaroni and cheese is cheaper than that, or poor people work 2 or 3 jobs, so they don't have time to exercise, or poor people live in neighborhoods with violent crime, so they can't go to playgrounds or play on the street, things like that. Or that gyms cost a lot of money, fitness clubs. So what they are saying is that poverty causes fatness. That is, first you are poor, and because you are poor, you can't exercise, you can't buy organic foods, etc., you become fat. And actually the research shows the opposite directionality, and that is that fatness results in poverty. That is, first you are fat, and thanks to job discrimination and other kinds of discrimination, you drift into a lower income group. As Paul Ernsberger has said, while there's evidence that poverty is fattening, a stronger case can be made for the converse: fatness is impoverishing. So if I had 2 sisters, one who was much thinner than I am, one who was much fatter than I am, the data show that my thinner sister would get into more elite colleges. My thinner sister would get a job that pays more, has more benefits, and if my sister is heterosexual, would marry a man with a higher income, so that family income would be higher than my fat sister. Oops, I seem to be, oh, here we go. There's so a lot of research on employment bias, including my own, shows that fat people are less likely to be hired, perceived as having undesirable traits, are more harshly disciplined on the job, given inferior assignments, paid less, viewed as liabilities for employee health benefits, and fired for not losing weight. And there's also a large body of research looking at non-employment settings. Fat people, especially girls and women, are negatively evaluated by children, adolescents, and adults, by health professionals, even by landlords. And the stigma of weight holds fat people responsible for their weight. If they would only have willpower, this wouldn't be a problem. I just want to talk about the intersection of weight and other demographic areas. Paul Campos has argued that given the strong relationship between weight and income, fat prejudice is a subtle way to discriminate against poor people, and thus also people of color, without being overtly racist and classist. So another thing you see in the media is sort of code. Somebody has gained weight because they ate pan dulce or collard greens, code for ethnicity and race. And many weight loss organizations, of course, are always trying to recruit as many people as possible, and are now developing what they call culturally sensitive weight loss programs for people of color. In terms of sexual orientation or sexuality, in the 1980s, there were 2 articles about lesbians and body image. One of them by Sari Dworkin, she said, lesbians are women and women are told how to look. And so, any woman has this focus of appearance. The same year, Laura Brown wrote an article where she said that lesbian communities are more accepting of diversity, including awareness of fat oppression. I also want to argue that it could be being sexually involved with men that influences concerns about weight and dieting. That would mean that heterosexual women and gay men, that is people involved with men, would be more affected by weight norms than lesbians and heterosexual men, that is people involved with women. So who is right? Well, the research has shown that both Sari Dworkin and Laura Brown are both kind of right. Many studies find that there's a gender difference in obsession with weight, frequency of dieting, with women more likely to do that. But there are studies that have found that it is heterosexual women and gay men, and that lesbians and heterosexual men are less affected by that. In terms of bisexual women and men, there's been fairly little research, but I just want to say for those of you who are students and looking for a research area, this is a great topic because some people who are bisexual, not everybody, have actually been involved with women and with men, maybe not at the same time, but sequentially. And so you can ask them when you were involved with women versus when you were involved with men, was there a difference in how you felt about your body, your food preferences, and so on. Also, in terms of gender expression or transgender issues, one of the authors of the Fat Studies Reader, Bear Bergman, says the following: whether I'm fat or not depends on whether the person or people looking at me believe me to be a man or a woman. As a man, I'm a big dude, but not outside the norm for such things. As a big guy, I'm big enough to make miscreants or troublemakers decide to take their hostility elsewhere, big enough to walk calmly through the streets because I'm safe unless there's no easier target. As a woman, I'm revolting. I'm not only unattractively mannish, but also grossly fat. The clothes I can fit into at the local big girl stores tend to fit around the neck and then get bigger as they go downward, which results in a festive butch in a bag look, all the rage, nowhere, ever. So what I think is great about this is the same person. This is Bear. And depending on how Bear is read as a man or as a woman really affects how people react. So again, I think this is a great area for research. I also want to point out that it is perfectly legal to discriminate against people based on their weight in almost any part of the world. The only places with weight anti-discrimination laws are the US states of Michigan and Washington, a few cities that I've listed here, 4 counties in Maryland, the state of Victoria in Australia, the city of Reykjavik in Iceland, and some of you may have read this week that the country of Brazil is now enacting some laws banning weight discrimination. So I want to talk about what I have called weapons of mass distraction, that whenever I talk about weight, people will say, but aren't they unhealthy? And why can't they just lose weight? This was not my area of interest, but I've had to become kind of an expert in it. So first of all, let me talk about the health issue. Remember that fat people tend to be poor and rich people tend to be thin. So that means if you are comparing fat and thin people on health, you're really comparing poor people with rich people. And especially in the US, where we don't have a national health policy, obviously, if you are poorer, you're going to be in poorer health. So you really have to control for income. You either have to do that statistically, or you have to compare fat and thin people who make similar incomes. The other thing is there's no control for dieting, and dieting itself is a big health risk. And fatter people have dieted more than thin people. Even, it's very hard to control absolutely what people are eating, but you can do this with laboratory animals and researchers who put rats on a diet. The way you put rats on a diet is you let rats eat whatever pellets they want, and then half the rats get to keep eating what they want, and the other half are given fewer pellets until they lose 20% of their weight. Then they're allowed to eat freely again, and they're put on a diet again. When you do that, 2 things happen. The first one is that it takes longer and longer for the rats to lose weight with each successive diet, and quicker for them to regain the weight. And the other is they have a lot of health problems, some of which I've listed here: high blood pressure, craving for fat, high cholesterol, heart disease, and death. I have no idea how you measure blood pressure in a rat. You put a tiny cuff on their paws or something like that. There's also no control for the stress of living as a member of an oppressed group, being bullied and victimized your whole life. I also want to say here, let's suppose that even when all these confounds are controlled, there is still a difference between fat and thin people in health. This does not necessarily mean that putting fat people on a diet will improve their health. Formerly fat people, that is successful dieters, are not the same as always thin people. It may not be great to be living in a body that is so much lower than your metabolism should be at. And I also want to say that fat people are reluctant to seek medical treatment. They get disrespectful treatment. They're embarrassed at being weighed. There are negative attitudes of providers, unsolicited advice to lose weight, medical equipment that doesn't fit their size. And so fat people wait longer before they go in to see a doctor or health professional. In the study I did of members of NAFA, they had really horrendous comments. Somebody wrote, my doctor said, if I looked like you, I would take a gun and shoot myself. Somebody said, my doctor said, if I had $1 for every pound you're overweight, I could pay off my mortgage. So you can imagine that people are reluctant to seek medical care. I also want to bring up the vast power of the pharmaceutical industry in this country. If you're putting out a drug, let's say to treat cholesterol, well, it would help if more people had high cholesterol. You would make millions more in profits. So what do? You argue that the cutoff for what is high cholesterol should be lower. So a lot happened here in the 1990s. First of all, body mass index, BMI, for overweight changed in 1998 from 27 down to 25. Overnight, over 30 million people went to bed normal weight and woke up overweight. Glucose went up from 140 down to 126, which meant there were 1.7 million new cases of diabetes. And also this new category of pre-diabetes started, which was defined as 110, and then went down in 2003 to 100. High blood pressure went from 160 over 100 down to 140 over 90, 13.5 million new cases of hypertension. And then this new category of pre-hypertension was defined as 120 over 80. And cholesterol, take a look at this. It went from 240 down to 200, 42 million new cases of high cholesterol. Now, people often say to me, well, isn't this based on science? Well, first of all, there's no question that if your blood pressure, glucose, or cholesterol goes way up, you're going to probably have health problems. But what is subjective is the cutoff. So think about this. At Syracuse University, the admissions committee probably has a certain grade point average where they will not take a student, even if they're the daughter of the president or a varsity athlete. But that cutoff is subjective. Every university has a slightly different one. They don't tell you what it is, but it's there. So, the cutoff itself is subjective. You might even say, well, what's the problem with giving everybody cholesterol drugs from birth or at age 10? The problem is these drugs have side effects. So here's an article that this drug for diabetes was causing heart risks. And of course, Lipitor, the most commonly prescribed drug for high cholesterol, also has a lot of negative side effects. One more thing about health, I want to talk about mortality. And I know it's probably a beautiful day out there, but I have to warn you again that everybody will die. The mortality rate is 1 per person. Here is a spoof from The Onion, world death rate holding steady at 100%. So when mortality rates go down, if you read about that, that doesn't mean that some people have eternal life. And healthy countries have high rates of cardiovascular disease and cancer. I just want to repeat that. Healthy countries have high rates of cardiovascular disease and cancer. Why? Because they have people who live to an old age. When people die of infant mortality, war-related death, natural disasters, accidents, malnutrition, and infectious disease, they are not going to live to an old age. So cancer and cardiovascular disease are the major causes of death in healthy countries. So if you read something in the media like Nepal has an increase in cancer, that's actually good news. It means that people are not dying at a younger age. Also, because cancer and cardiovascular disease are the 2 most common areas, ways of dying, that means that if you cure cancer, let's say breast cancer is cured, it's completely treatable, well, then people are going to die of something else. If somebody has died in their sleep, it doesn't mean they died of sleep. So let me talk about why can't they just lose weight. The research on weight loss typically randomly assigns people to one of several treatment conditions, including a waiting list control group. It weighs people before and after treatment, and then after 6 months or a year. And these are people who are not average weight, who typically have a high BMI, body mass index. These studies have a very high dropout rate, especially when people are in the waiting list group, or they don't like the treatment to which they were randomly assigned, or they don't lose weight. So when you're looking at people after treatment and weighing them, what you can't have access to are the people who dropped out. They are no longer there. Also, these studies report how much weight people lost. They don't focus on how many people went from a clinical to a non-clinical BMI level. Now, when people do research on cigarette smoking, they actually focus on people who quit. That is, people who smoke 0 cigarettes. They don't look at people who smoked 40 cigarettes before treatment and 27 cigarettes after treatment. But that's how the weight loss research is done. Because if they focused on people who went from clinical to non-clinical levels, none of these studies could get published. It just doesn't happen. Back in 1958, Albert Stunkard said, most obese persons will not stay in treatment of obesity. Of those who stay in treatment, most will not lose weight. And of those who do lose weight, most will regain it. More recently, Susan Woolley and David Garner said, weight loss treatments provide patients with failure experiences, expose them to professionals who hold them in low regard, cause them to see themselves as deviant and flawed, confuse their perceptions of hunger and satiety, and divert their attention away from other problems. You may have heard of the health at every size movement, where the focus is not on weight, but on health. And as the authors of this, Lindo Bacon, Deb Burgard, and others have said, everybody should have access to nutritious food free of toxins and pesticides, access to health care and health insurance, ability to engage in fun sports and activities, access to a secure job, adequate sleep, and a supportive community of family and friends. I am very intrigued by how few fat people have organized. So again, those of you here are really in the vanguard of that. My university has probably, I would say 15 organizations for students who are LGBTQ+, which is wonderful. There's a Pride Center, a queer student union, a gay fraternity, a lesbian sorority, a faculty group, Lavender graduation, LGBT studies, and so on. And yet I would argue that on our campus, 80% of students, especially women, feel bad about their bodies or feel too fat, and there isn't a single organization about that. How come? Well, I think thinness is one of the major criteria in determining physical attractiveness in the US. It's difficult for women to violate appearance norms. They are not trivial. Fat people, especially women, tend to be poor in the US and have less political power. Fat people are blamed for their weight. Most people believe that diets are effective if the dieter has willpower. And I think most importantly, a multi-billion-dollar economy would collapse if people stop focusing on their weight, including the diet soda industry, the diet cookbook industry, the diet food industry, the number of people who join fitness clubs to lose weight, and so on. So the creation of fat studies, Marilyn Wan says she was not the first to use the term. There was somebody before her, but I think she was the first to write about it. She wrote this book, Fat So, because you don't have to apologize for your size. And she's the one here in front in the pink jog bra. Fat studies have made tiny inroads in the academy. There is the Popular Culture Association and the National Women's Studies Association have fat studies groups, and the Association for Women in Psychology has a size acceptance group. So what can we do to throw our weight around? I would urge you to read original research articles about weight, not the media summaries. Follow the money, as Rachel Maddow, the newscaster, has said. If you're not scared, they're not making money. Speak out about oppression. It's not okay to discriminate against any group based on appearance. Ask ourselves and other people what we would be thinking and talking about if we weren't focused on weight and dieting, and follow the lead of other civil rights movements and organize. And of course, I want to talk about submitting your scholarship to academic journals, not just the journal Fat Studies, which I edit. I just want to say, you can see in the last 3 volumes, just the last 3 years, we've published articles from authors from all of these disciplines. Take a look at these disciplines I've listed here. This is really an area you can do in many different disciplines. And also we've published research from people in many different countries. Also, Fat Studies does book reviews. And again, in the last 3 years, we've included 27 book reviews of new fat affirmative books, focusing on such topics as the intersection of fat and the Black body, cultural history, embodiment, girls of color, health, Islam, media, medicine, memoirs, motherhood, politics, psychotherapy, rhetoric, social justice, television, and yoga. So there's a lot of books out there that are fat affirmative. And so finally, as Marilyn Wan has said, weight discrimination will continue to thrive so long as efforts to end it focus on changing people's bodies rather than changing people's minds. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Rothblum. That was wonderful. We could take a few questions right now. If anyone has a question, you could put an X in the chat. You could use the raise hand reaction button. So if anyone has one right off the bat, and then we will, when we are done with questions, we will take a short break and come back for Dr. Cox's presentation. So any questions at the moment? Okay, I am not seeing any questions right now. So I think what we'll do is take a break until 10 a.m. And then we will come back for Dr. Cox's presentation. And then after that, we will hopefully have questions with both Dr. Cox and Dr. Rothblum. So thank you very much. See you at 10. All right, welcome back, everyone. We are back to listen to the words of wisdom from Dr. Joy Cox, who received her PhD in communication from Rutgers University in 2018. She considers herself a social justice advocate. And yes, we also consider her that. And she uses her skills to foster social change through the promotion of real diversity and inclusion initiatives. Much of her work has focused on matters of intersectionality addressing race, body size, accessibility, and, quote, health within the context of body acceptance and fat liberation. In addition to her research and teaching, her book Fat Girls in Black Bodies was published last fall. Dr. Cox hosts the Fresh Out the Cocoon podcast, which showcases the lived experiences of fat Black women and femmes. And she's co-founded Jabby, an identity-inclusive, body-affirming app that encourages people to move their bodies in their own way. Welcome, Dr. Cox.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here today. I'm excited to speak to everyone. I'm also overjoyed and happy that Esther went ahead of me. There was a lot of things that she touched on that now I don't have to cover. But in kind of thinking about this presentation and putting something together, I got in front of the computer and I was like, let me put these slides together. I'm gonna put these things together because I want people to know. And I kept trying to put things on, on the PowerPoint, the conventional way that we do it, and it just wasn't clicking. And so what I hope to do today is speak to you all a little bit from my heart, a little bit from the work that I've done. I think that it'd be most helpful for me to kind of share my own story and my transition into the space of fat studies, because I didn't start there. And since my undergrad, I always studied communication. So human communication, because when I say communication, everybody's like, oh, you like TV. And I'm like, no, not exactly. That's not where we are. I like to tell people that I'm a people watcher by trade. That's what I do. That's what I get paid for. That's what brings me joy in life. And so human communication was always my track of research and study. I didn't start out in looking at matters of weight and weight stigma. I've always lived in a larger body as a fat Black woman, cisgender woman. And I always kind of moved through the earth understanding and knowing that my body was different. I knew that people judge me differently based on my body. I knew that people judge me differently based on my appearance. But it wasn't until I ran into fat studies and actually was able to put language to some of the things that I had experienced in life. And I will say that I ran into fat studies when I was about 30 years old. So you can imagine kind of living in a world and in a society where you didn't always have the language to advocate for yourself. And I found myself in a lot of spaces being younger, having to do so. So of course I was overjoyed when I found that there was actually a field of study that had been created that would not only give me language to talk about my own experiences, but it would also give me motivation and inspiration to really do research, because that was something that I was super interested in. And so as I started on my journey in about 2013, I would mark it. I think I did my first presentation on body image in about 2011. I was a non-traditional student. I decided to go back to school when I was 25 years old. So here I am, roughly 28 years old, talking about body image, my junior year of undergrad at West Virginia University. And I should have known then, like, hey, something's a little weird here after I gave my presentation, and nobody had any questions, and nobody wanted to talk about nobody wanted the follow up. Nobody wanted to expound on the topic and the ways by which we talk about body image and appearance and the weight that has in the society that we live in. And it wasn't until 2013 that I really started to dig into matters of weight stigma, after seeing there was a news a story that ran, this is back when I used to actually watch TV at 11 o'clock when the news came on. There was a news story that ran about, there was an attempt to make fatness or obesity, it was to be classified as a disability. And I remember seeing that story on TV and being so upset. I was so worked up. For reference, I am a middle child. I have two sisters. One is older than me and one is younger than me, and they are both smaller than me, and they always have been. And I remember calling my oldest sister and being infuriated. Can you believe that this is what they're going to do? I can't believe this is happening. And I remember my oldest sister not getting it. Just kind of like, well, what is the big deal? I don't understand why you're so upset about it. And I was like, because I'm big and I've been large my whole life. And this is not, it's not classified the way, I've been living this life. And I know the difference between what it means to be able-bodied and what it doesn't mean to be able-bodied, even though I live in a larger body. And I think that was on the weekend. The Monday morning, I walked into my advisor's office. And I told him, I said, listen, whatever I was studying before, I'm not going to study that anymore. This is what we're going to study. I want to study weight stigma, and I need to switch my plan. I need to switch whatever it is that we're going to do here. And this is what we're going to study. And my advisor was gracious enough to oblige. And he was like, okay, well, how are we going to work this? How can we create, the rest of your time here to put you on track to still finish on time and produce a product that's going to be worthy of you getting a degree. And so that started my journey into fat liberation, as I would call it. And that was not just academically, but that was also personally. And so there was a lot of things that I lived through personally that I experienced while also researching what was already out there, because I didn't know that certain things existed. A lot of the things that Esther talked about previously, I didn't know that there was published research that talked about, how there were no studies that fatness caused disease. I kind of grew up always not necessarily thinking it, but being confronted with that type of information, right? Doctors telling me, oh, well, just wait and see, right? Nothing's wrong today, but something might be wrong tomorrow because you're too heavy. I remember I was 16, I got my gallbladder out. I had a doctor tell me before the doctor that was going to perform the actual procedure, before I left his office, he smirked at me and he told me to stop eating so much fried chicken. I was 16 years old at that time. I didn't understand the intersections between race and fat phobia, but I was upset about it. And there were things that I couldn't pinpoint, I couldn't figure out. And so moving into a space where I could say, okay, I'm going to do research about this. And in my mind, right, I'm putting on my Superman cape, I'm tying myself up and I'm saying, I'm getting ready to change the world. Okay. I was ready to go. And then something else started to happen. I'm in the academy, I'm studying, right? I'm coming up with great research questions. I'm looking at the ways in which I can find answers to this. I'm surrounded by people who live in larger bodies. I'm surrounded by the fat community. And I'm like, still finding barriers. Still coming up against, and not just academically, but also within the community, which is what led me to do my dissertation research the way that I did. And so for my dissertation research, I set out to really look at the history of fat liberation and to look at, the things that it has afforded us, as well as the barriers that are still very much present. And what I found in this process was that there was a lot of work that was being done in academia that wasn't trickling down. Things weren't coming back to the people who helped to build a lot of the things that we talk about today, right? A lot of things that was referenced in the first presentation are people who have lived through these experiences. And very much like Esther said at the end, she said, well, why isn't there we're the fat people who are organizing. And it's not that fat people necessarily aren't organizing, but they're not organizing in the way that maybe we think about it in our, in our minds, or we expect to see it. But to that point, it was like, well, who, for me, it led to more questions. It led to me kind of digging a little bit deeper and really trying to figure out, well, where are people who look like me? Where's that community at? Where's the rest of the community of marginalized individuals who are doing this work? Because I can guarantee that even from my own research, anywhere that you've seen someone who is, white, able-bodied, cisgender, who also lives in a larger body, anywhere that you see that work showcased, there's always fat, Black, and brown, disabled, marginalized people who are doing the same work, right? They just don't get the same type of recognition. And so in the process of me going to conferences and being questioned on a number of things that really had nothing to do with my research as a whole, but more just on the merit of the fact that I'm somebody who wants to study about fat bodies and raise awareness about weight stigma, I started to realize that maybe the ivory towers wasn't the only place that I needed to house the work that I wanted to do. Through my dissertation work, I purposely made up in my heart and my mind that I would publish about weight stigma, because I needed the lived experiences of the people who I interviewed to be in print. And so during the process of me doing my dissertation, my 4 years, 3 years and 8 months, I believe, doing my PhD, I really did take a social justice approach in looking at the ways in which we could create footprints within academia that said we couldn't be erased. And so my dissertation was really a work towards that goal. My dissertation was utilized in a way that I felt would be helpful for people who often give their stories to us as researchers and never get anything back. And so I wanted to make sure that they were noted in my dissertation. Fresh Out the Cocoon, my podcast that I started, I think in 2017, I was so revved up with all of the things that I have been looking at and that I have been researching that really, like who starts a podcast during their second year of their PhD when you got to study for quals and all of these things. But I was ramped up and I was ready to go, and I started the podcast. And part of the reason why I started the podcast was because during the time when I was doing my research and I was gathering information, I was also finding that there was no giving back to people. Like there wasn't anything that was being created that I could say, again, we take people for research studies, we get people to kind of put their life on record for us for an hour or 90 minutes, kind of showing us the things that they've been through in life. But there wasn't anything that just allowed people to be fat and fabulous in the space that I was working in. And so I created the podcast for that reason. And then kind of moving from there, working on my dissertation and doing those things, I also realized that most people are not going to read my dissertation. Even as much as I will say, I thought it was well written, I thought it was put together fairly well. There's research that lends itself that says that most people don't read published academic journals. And part of that, it's hard to talk about academia and not talk about power structures and not talk about the ways in which that is on purpose in some ways, right? And so it's a lot of being able to have access to resources. And I published on weight stigma. I published on body image. I spoke at conferences and all of these places. And what I was still finding was that to get back to the community, there had to be another avenue, right? And so on some level, on one avenue or in one lane, you fight power, right, in that space. I didn't expect myself to be, a scholar that was going to necessarily change academia, but I wanted to make sure that I left a mark there that said, hey, somebody cared enough to study this. Somebody cared enough to document the lived experiences of fat people living in this country, in this society, in the wonderful year of 2018. And I wanted to make sure that those people who were also being quoted in, in the things that I was studying also represented more of the fat community that often did not get talked about or get seen. And so that was your fat Black and brown, disabled, different gendered individuals. And so for me, that was important. But it also screamed to a greater need that was necessary as it related to what was currently happening on the ground. And I think that that is something that oftentimes when you go into academia, people don't tell you about, right? And so having to create your own lane to make sure that your work gets heard and it gets seen, sometimes that's the work of the academic, right? It's not necessarily facilitated by people who are in the academy. And so particularly when we start talking about things like fat studies, during the time of me doing my dissertation, what I was realizing is that there was a lot of work that was being done through social media channels, but not something that was necessarily being formalized in the way that you think about other movements, right? And so in the previous presentation, there was a lot of talk about what's known as the fatosphere, which I kind of love a lot. Like it makes me feel warm and fuzzy on the inside. But it's great to know that, marginalized populations, we have found active ways to gather information and to gather together in community to create change. And what does that look like for us? And how do we take some of the research that's already been done and how do we mobilize it in a way that it becomes empowering for the community, right? Because one of the things that I think is unique about fat studies or about, the studying of weight stigma and fat phobia is that it's very much a social justice issue. And so social justice issues are not afforded the luxury to just stay in one space. They're not afforded the luxury to just stay in journals, academic journals, right? Or in conferences. Part of my background growing up is that I think for between the year of 2000 and about 2011, I used to be very much involved in the church. At one point I was ordained. But I got accustomed to being, you understand preaching. You understand what that means, that you go, you might go to a service every Sunday and somebody's going to tell you some things and it's going to encourage you and it should make you feel better. But there doesn't necessarily need to be physical action attached to those things. Whereas when we are dealing with matters of social justice, we realize that action is imperative and it is necessary. And so as someone who was very much interested in looking at fat studies and looking at weight stigma, it was fairly clear to me during the beginning of my studies that it wasn't good enough just for me to have a repertoire in academia. So I had to start to look for inroads and really think about how I could expand the work that I was doing, at least from my perspective, in a way to give back to a community that helped me to survive, right? When there was no language, right? So almost like there was a revisiting, kind of coming back to a space of origin for me, even though I had found out this information. I was super excited that there was language. I was super excited, that fat studies was around, but very much so, I didn't see myself in a lot of the things that was published about fat studies. And when I started to look at the history of, organizations, when we talk about fat positive organizations, I didn't see myself. I didn't see a lot of people who looked like me. And so there was a push, an extra push for me to say, okay, so what does life look like outside of the ivory towers? What does life look like for my work outside of the ivory towers? And that was scary in some ways, because again, nobody kind of preps you for that. Nobody talks to you about those things. Even if we're talking about matters of writing books, it's typically within the lane of, well, what is it like? What does it look like for you to write, an academic book, something that's more geared towards, the academia and in that space. And I knew I didn't want to write something like that. I knew that, I feel strongly that there is a requirement, almost like we as researchers should feel obligated to give back to the communities that help build our reputation in these other spaces. And so for me, I wanted to make sure that I could do something like that. And so fast forward to 2019, I believe, 2018 into 2019, I was contacted by North Atlantic Books about writing a book. And when they first sent me the proposal, I thought it was spam. And and I sought to ignore their invitation. Initially, I said, this is not something, somebody's playing in my mailbox. And so I need to, I should ignore it. But there was a nudging in me to kind of go back and see what was happening with this particular email. And when I did, I spoke to the people at North Atlantic Books, and they didn't ask for much for me. They went and they pitched the book for me, which was very nice. And then they said, okay, this is what we want you to write. And Fat Girls and Black Bodies, Creating Communities of Our Own was published in 2020. Some of that was from the work that I did on my dissertation, but most of what I published in Fat Girls and Black Bodies was about my own lived experience and the lived experiences of those that I interviewed on my podcast. And that sprung a new lane for me to really talk about weight stigma and really talk about the lived experiences of the people who often don't get talked about. And I thought to myself, okay, I think I might be okay. I think I might be all right. And really kind of departing a little bit from the value that we often put on academic publishing, what happens within academia and the ivory towers. And today I sit, before you as, again, a fat Black woman who has a number of different barriers that are set against them. When we talk about appearance, even Black women in smaller bodies are not seen as the standard. Black women in smaller bodies are not seen as attractive. And so having to do this work, living in a fat Black body, took a good amount of courage. In some ways, some people would say that I put my career on the line because I could have studied anything. The opportunities that, were made available to individuals who may have studied something that was more in the line of what communication research is and what it stands for and how it operates, they soared in ways that I didn't. They got opportunities that I didn't get. When people talk about scholars who are in the field, I was not recommended. I was not on the list. How dare them? I was not on the list of recommended scholars, even though I did my job well. Qualitative research was something that I took a lot of pride in, being able to sit down with individuals and talk to them and interview them about the things that were close to their hearts was important to me. And so again, just being in that space and understanding that there needs to be a pivot, right? There needs to be a change. And it's not one or the other. I think that sometimes we say, well, we give middle fingers to the academy, and we say that the academy really doesn't have a whole lot of value, to where I say, no, I think that the academy does have a certain level of value. You just got to understand how to leverage what it is that you want to do, and allow the leverage to kind of push you and propel you forward. And so there were a lot of doors that were open to me due to academia. I would have never learned how to do research the way that I do it. I also would have never been able to point out the shortcomings and why research shows up the way that it does. And so for me to be able to have a critical lens on fat studies, on weight stigma, on fat phobia, was extremely enriching for the work that I wanted to do. And so now being in this space where I've written a book, and that has allowed me a number of different opportunities. And I'll just quickly, because I hate to talk, I don't want to talk about myself in this way, but kind of just to harp on, some of the opportunities that have been afforded to me that I think does push the conversation forward as it relates to weight stigma. I did some work with Nestle over at the UK, talking about weight stigma, talking about the things that employees can do, or employers can do to make the work environment better for people who live in larger bodies. And that came from the book. I was featured on CNN's podcast with Sanjay Gupta and talking about, what it means to be able to accept your body during this time that we live in a pandemic and everybody is horrified because their bodies are getting larger. That stemmed from a New York Times article that I was published in, that stemmed from the book. And so, when I think about those things and I think about the type of recognition, or not the recognition, but even just the exposure that has come with being able to write a book and having the courage to kind of step outside of academia, I'm extremely grateful for that. Extremely grateful that there are these other avenues. And now I see books popping up everywhere from authors everywhere about this topic. And I'm not just talking about, I'm talking about authors who look like me, or authors who have marginalized identities, being able to voice their experiences about what it means to live in society, who also on some level come from academic backgrounds, which tells me on some level that somebody somewhere is understanding that there's a need that needs to be filled. And the hope is that academia can kind of get on board with that and see that, there needs to be an expansion of the avenues by which we do our work and how we utilize that, right? Is there another way that we can publish our work outside of academic journals? Is there a way that we can publish our work so that it's not behind these large paywalls? When I think about conferences, sometimes I sit back and think that, hey, you pay a membership fee, and then you submit your work, and if it gets accepted, then you pay to attend the conference and do the presentation. And I said, wait a minute, I don't think that's how it's supposed to work. Why is it working? But this is the structure of academia, right? And a lot of the work that we get from people who are on the ground. A lot of the work that we get from these marginalized populations, right? We get from people who are in impoverished situations, in part because when we do research, it's typically incentivized, right? And so people are taking the time to share their hearts with us and to share their stories with us. And we are going off and we are writing books and we are doing speaking engagements and we're doing all of these things. But how are we finding ways to take what we've done and the things that we have summarized to be meaningful as it relates to the lived experiences of these people? How are we taking those things and giving it back to the community? Because I feel like in those spaces, those are the spaces for organizing, right? Those are the spaces where with our power, whether it be big or small, right? We are in a position as academics, we have a certain level of privilege and we have a certain level of access. And we also have a certain level of access to resources that people who we interview don't. And how can we take those things? How can we package those things and empower the people who help in a lot of ways to empower us, right? And so for me, departing away from academia, at least for the work that I do, was necessary in a number of different ways. And I'm grateful that I made the decision to depart when I did. Now, a little bit, kind of taking it a step further, I guess, from where I am right now. In December of 2021, I accepted a position at Facebook. So now I am a qualitative researcher at Meta, Facebook. It's all interchangeable at this point. But I look at the ways in which I was afforded an opportunity. So one of the things that they do at Meta, your last round of interviews is very much like a campus interview. And I had to present on a topic. I had to present on a project that I worked on from start to finish, which was one of the stipulations of me getting hired, doing the research that I did. And I presented on my dissertation. And so here I am, in front of all the Meta executives. They tell you that when you interview for Meta, you don't just interview for a team or for a department, you interview for the whole company. So people from Facebook, people from IG, people from WhatsApp, everybody's in the room, right? And then they're like, welcome, Joy, how are you? And I'm like, I'm great. And today I want to talk to you about a project that I worked on. And I'm like, bam, the fat liberation movement. And I present, right? And it takes me a good 40 minutes to talk about the fat liberation movement and the problem in society that we have with weight stigma. And I'm pointing out issues that, even on social media, on platforms like Facebook, and I'm like, oh my God, Joy, what are you doing? On platforms like Facebook, right? There is this discrimination that's happening against people who live in these larger bodies, and I get to the end of the end of the presentation. I'm like, thank you for your time. Are there any questions? Are there any questions? And one of the people from Facebook, they asked me, they said, well, what do you think we can do at Facebook to help, tackle this problem? How can we change what we do? And I think in that moment, I kind of realized, I said, even if I didn't get the position at Meta, this part right here was worth it. Right? To have your work put in front of people who are also in positions of power and say, hey, this thing that you are creating, that you keep talking about, that aids in community, it doesn't aid in all communities. As a matter of fact, my community is suffering because of some of the things that you put in place. And to have someone stand and say, okay, well, how can we fix it? How can we change it? Mattered to me. But I don't believe I would have been given that same opportunity had I just stayed in academia, had I stayed in the lane that I was in, because a lot of the recognition that I've gotten since I've gotten my PhD is because of the book, is because I decided to change lanes and I decided to do something else. And again, if we are going to structure fat studies or structure the tackle on weight stigma and fat phobia as a social justice issue, we got to find a way to take what we know, the expertise that we have, to take what we know and to find a space where that can be empowerment for people who don't have the same levers that we do, who don't have the same resources that we do, who don't have the same power that we do. And so, I think that taking a step back and really having, and really thinking about it, because I don't think sometimes that we give ourselves enough time to really think about those things. I think that, we get so caught up in academics in the way that things are done, because we got to publish, right? Like if you're in a tenure position, in academia, you're thinking about publishing, you're thinking about doing things the way that things have always been done to kind of move you from one space to the next. And in some ways, that's no fault of your own. It's like we're all trying to move forward. We're all trying to get ahead, and while simultaneously all surviving. But it takes having a critical eye and really looking at the ways in which, how can I take what I can use today? And oftentimes, when I do presentations on weight stigma and fat phobia, we talk about matters of privilege. What does it mean for you to be in the position that you're in? And even I had to check myself and say, okay, well, I'm in a position of privilege, right? Being part of academia is a position of privilege. Having these 3 letters behind my name is privilege, right? And there are a lot of people in my community who will never be heard. But I probably could do some things with the position that I have. I probably could do some things with what I've learned in academia and give them back to individuals, even if it's something small like teaching people how to read research. I think one of the biggest arguments that I come across as it relates to people like just in mainstream society, everybody thinks that they're an expert. And I know that like we've had this issue with the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, people think that they know how to read research. People think that they know what studies say, right? And so when they, people 60% of this and 30% of that, and you sit and you tell them and say, well, that's not, what you're reading in some ways is descriptive statistics. That's not the research. Like, then everybody looks at you and nobody kind of gets like why you're saying what you're saying. And part of that is because there's ignorance, there's a barrier, an active barrier. I think some of it is by design, some of it is just that you're in another space in life. And it's not relative to how you live, to what research is, how it operates, all of those things. People don't understand that, there's a lot of subjective factors that go into how research is conducted, and even more so how it can be interpreted. And that's why, when we argue about issues of representation and people, people in communities interviewing the people who are part of their communities, why that's so important, right? Because if you're out of touch, I guarantee you're going to interpret some things the wrong way. And so, I think about how in both small and large ways we can take what we have and what we've learned from academia and give it back to communities in a way that it empowers them to move forward, because they have the legs and oftentimes they have the innovation. That's something else that I learned in being able to interview individuals, is that they're the ones with the ideas. They're the ones that say, hey, well, maybe we can hold a gathering here, or we can do something over here, or I'm thinking about this art piece, or I want to be able to shape fatness through this lens. And it's like, oh, okay, well, this is great. This is awesome. I never thought about that. I'm just here to get the interview. But because of the way that education is seen in our society, we're usually the ones that get the accolades, as opposed to the people who are actually doing the real work. And so I think I'm running short. But I don't want to keep repeating myself. But, again, I'm grateful, super grateful for the presentation that came before me, because I think it lays out a good history as it relates to fat studies, as it relates to fat liberation in some ways, and the work that's already been done, right? The organizations that already exist. And the only thing that I'm here to say in some ways is to encourage us to take it a step further. What does liberation look like beyond the academy, right? What does fat liberation look like beyond the academy, right? How do we address weight stigma and fat phobia beyond academic articles? Because what I've learned is that even when you come with if the pandemic hasn't taught us anything, is that even when you come with all the necessary science, right? And you are the person, you're the expert in the room, there's still a barrier that exists between people who want to believe it and people who don't, right? And so I've taken charge with my own life and saying, I'm not here trying to convince people to believe something about me or about my capabilities or my abilities as a fat Black person. But I do want to show up for my community. Right? I do want to show up for my community, and I do want to empower my community so that they feel capable, so that they can run in the lanes that they have, the desires that they have. And some of that is us knocking down, structures of power and all of that stuff, rah, 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 set it all on fire. There are people who are well equipped to do that. I'm not one of those people. I mean, but I could bring the lighter. And so, to really think about the avenues that we have made available for us. And I thank you all for your time. And Dr. Brown, I will turn it back over to you if that's okay. And yes, thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. That was wonderful, Joy. Thank you, thank you. Um, and it's funny that a lot of the things that you were saying are things that I've been wondering about, and I want to open it up to questions from people who you could either type a question in the chat if you want me to read it. And this would be for either Joy Cox or Esther Rothblum. You could put an X in the chat, and then you'll unmute yourself and you can ask your own question. Um, but I would love to start the questions off actually, because a lot of what you said in that last bit there was exactly what I was thinking, and so you posed the questions, Joy, like, what would a social justice movement look like outside the academy? And funny, that's what I was going to ask you, actually. And I was thinking, like, is there, and Esther, like, I'm wondering, like, what do each of you see as what, what can we really do with fat studies both within the academy and outside of it? Like where could it go from here, right? So maybe start with Esther and then move to Joy. Would that work?
Sure, that was a wonderful talk, Joy. Great to hear it. Yeah, it, thinking back to the 1960s and the women's movement, or even the 1950s, there wasn't much an individual could do. You really needed a community. And so I think with fat studies, what has been wonderful is people forming groups, organizations, as Joy is doing, podcasts and just to get the word out. And I'm beginning to see, tiny steps in that regard, even in, medical systems or student training or things like that. So, I mean, definitely, what usually happens in academia is there are community movements, and as a result, academia changes. In my university, women's studies started when it was students who were protesting that their classes had no mention of women. So we like to think that academics change policy, but really, I think it's the other way around.
Yeah, and I would second that. And I think that, I think one of the beautiful things is that the fat community is not a monolith. So we are like spiders or octopus. Like we have our hands, our tentacles are like in everything. And that's across genres, whether that's art, whether that's, being on the ground, whether that's students at universities. And so I think that there are power in numbers. There is when we get together as a community, I think about the number of people. I'm thinking about Reagan Chastain's work and how she's created, cards, and she's taught people how to go into doctors' offices and be like, I don't want to be weighed today, right? And I think that something that small can have such impact in spaces that once people get the courage to be able to do it and they spread the word, then somebody else does it, right? Then doctors have to go back and be like, hey, I have patients who are refusing to be weighed. Like, what are we going to do about this? Let me go look, and the hope is that you have doctors that are willing to go back and look and say, okay, well, what is the issue here? But I think that when we start to talk about how we can move in groups, in numbers, I think change really starts to happen. And sometimes it does start from some small individual practices. I think one of the awesome things about, I shouldn't say maybe awesome isn't the best word, but one of the most interesting things I think about being part of marginalized groups is that the change that you can create simply by existing is phenomenal. Like if you're in a space where nobody else expects you to be, i.e. the beach in a bikini, right? Like I think that there's power in that. And I think that people in finding their lanes, and I often talk about this because people say, well, what can we do? And it's like people look for prescriptions, like, well, we can do this and we can do that. Like, I like to encourage people to find that thing that speaks to you, because that's the thing that you're going to remain true to, right? That's the thing that's going to keep to empower you to move forward. Like you can take the education that's being given about a thing, but then learn how to apply it in a space that you feel most comfortable in, or you feel that you can make a change in, right? Like we're all not going to hit the beach in two pieces. I don't like water like that, just being honest. But you can take the education, right? And you can apply it somewhere. And it's going to have an impact where you are, where you can handle whatever comes after that, instead of trying to do something that's more prescriptive that you find yourself outside of your limits of comfortability. And that's not to say that everything should make you comfortable, but I think you all get the idea.
Oh, that's great. Thank you both. And I know I have some students here attending, so like, listen up. This is useful information for you guys. We do. I teach a course called Fat and Feminism, and their final project is an activism project of some kind. So, anyone who's looking for ideas, I hope you're here listening. Okay, we have a question from Michelle. So just go ahead, unmute yourself, and ask away.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay? Hi. Hi, I'm in the UK. I'm in Lowestoft on the east of the UK, and I'm doing my PhD looking at weight stigma in psychotherapy with the Open University. And so much of what both of you have said today, but Joy, particularly when you're talking about taking that message and changing lanes and looking at how that can have an influence in the community, and how the footprints from academia kind of go out into the community. Just so many amazing images that you've talked about today. And I think I've experienced a real shift today in the role of academia in my journey. So I wanted to thank you for that. I think there can be a kind of shame as a fat person being in the academy and taking your place, and I think that in itself is an internalized weight stigma. And I think while I've heard you talking, there's been a shift of, do you know what, I'm going to take that. I'll take that. I'll take that leverage, and I'm not going to be ashamed of being in academia anymore. And I'm going to take that message out into the community, and I'm going to center the voices of clients in my research, center the voice of fat therapists in my research, size affirmative therapists, and get that message out there for the benefit of clients and therapists. So I don't think that's so much of a question. I'm curious if that sense of taking your place in the academy was similar for you, but I think mainly it's thank you for allowing me to own that leverage of the academy in my work.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I mean, I think for me, I think there was some of that. There was, it comes. I mean, I think the thing about living in a space where you understand that weight stigma is prevalent, and that's like, that's everywhere. Having grown up always in a larger body, like I knew the blows were coming. I didn't know exactly where they were coming from, but you always kind of gear up for the fight, right? Like, it's like, well, they're going to say some stuff. Well, let them say it, because I'm on my way. I'm going, that's just something. So I understood on some level, like, you might lose out on opportunities as a result. And I think, even to that point, having also like the number of identities I have, I think I'm so accustomed to doing that, that at the time it was just like, well, this is everyday type stuff. You're always counting up the price of what it means to speak out, whether that's against racism, whether that's against sexism, whether that's against fat phobia, right? So like my career is always in limbo on some level because of the society that we live in. But then chalking that up and saying, okay, but if this is the price that I'm going to have to pay in hopes that somebody else be heard, that I'm going to center someone else, then that's what I'm going to do, right? And whatever kind of comes out of that is what's going to come out of that. And that's going to be a project that at the end of the day, I'm going to be proud of. And I know, for me, being able to publish that, to do my dissertation and my master's degree work, I said, this is something nobody can erase. It's there, right? And if that's all that comes out of that, I'm satisfied and I'm happy with it. And gratefully, it expanded beyond that. But I was willing to take, you take the risk. In some ways you take one for the team in hopes that it pushes forward the bigger agenda.
Yeah, I'm taking that image of the footprints with me. I love that, and I might even print out a footprint and put it in my office.
Thanks. I need to write that down myself.
Well, this conversation reminds me that there was a piece that came out some years ago by Rachel Fox, who wrote about, she was doing, I think she had done her PhD or she was applying to do PhD work in science. The piece was called Too Fat to Be a Scientist, and it was basically about the incredible fat stigma that she faced when she went, to labs and interviewed. For example, she told a story about going to a lab, getting the tour, talking with the principal investigator, and basically having a comment directed at her, something like, we don't want someone here who's going to eat all the pizza at lunchtime. Like the implication being you're going to eat more than your share of the communal pizza. So that's going to be a problem. And she ultimately left science. Science is loss, another field's gain, but I don't think those are unusual situations. But Esther, have you faced weight stigma, within the academy, and what has that been like for you?
Yeah, several things. I think that I have a mantra that when something starts to look good on my CV, it's time to move on to something else. Nevertheless, I would say to students, it helps to have a so-called mainstream area, whatever that is. And then you can do your radical work, because in academia, there is a lot of freedom to do that. And so I always say my mainstream area is LGBT studies, if you can believe it. That's how I was hired at San Diego State University. But the fat studies stuff at the time wouldn't have gotten me the job, but certainly I do a lot of that work also. So sometimes that strategy can help. And finally, I would urge everyone to keep copies of comments from reviewers of your submitted articles, and also, the kinds of comments that readers can now post when they read your work in the media. It is amazing. It's a great study of sort of popular opinions. So I remember when the Fat Studies Reader was reviewed in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is read by faculty and deans and provosts, people would say things like, I can't believe you're taking a slot in academia when more deserving people should be there. Those kinds of things are great. I have a whole slideshow on things like that and some of the different themes that come up.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. Moving on, we have a question from Ani.
Hello, hi everyone. My name's Stephanie. I'm in Ani's Gender, Food, and Rights class here at Syracuse University in the Food Studies department. And I have a few questions, but before that, I would just first like to say thank you to the presenters. Your presentations were very informative, and I really enjoyed them and learned a lot. My first question is, I was wondering if there have been fat studies or critical fat studies majors somewhere here in the United States, and if so, if those programs have succeeded or failed. My next question is, I'm writing a paper next week on critical fat studies for this class, and I was wondering, because the idea of structural fat discrimination and discrimination against fat bodies in general is kind of like, it's up and, I don't want to say up and coming, but it's like newer to what, what is considered in the mainstream. Like people don't really think about it or really like, here with like diet culture and the obsession with Western beauty standards, people would never think maybe of structural fat discrimination as a thing. So would you believe that like if we created here at Syracuse or whatever other university a fat studies major, would it succeed, or is this subject just too new or too shocking for people? And maybe even a step further, what do you think if we actually had a fat studies whole department? And is that even feasible, or do you think maybe it's not feasible anytime soon, but you think there's potential for that in the future because, you know, we have African American Studies Department, we have Women's Studies Department, and all of these marginalized groups at some point have been getting their own whole departments. And is it too far of a stretch, or people just like do not see it feasible to have a whole FAT Studies department? And then my third question is for Dr. Cox, specifically in that, you know, of course, like I try not to believe everything I see on the internet. And so I, you know, generally speaking, don't. But when I'm doing research for whatever reason and I see volume number, issue number, I'm like, well, it came from an academic journal, so I am naturally inclined to trust it as being fact. So do you have any tips for being able to parse out that information and reading academic journals and not just seeing it as fact because it has volume and issue number after that? Like, how do you actually know when conducting your research that it's information that you can trust? That's all. Thank you.
Well, let me just say before either of you jumps in that getting a minor in fat studies going at Syracuse University is a project I'm working on right now. So, yeah. But I think the question, so your first question, which was basically who has had fat studies majors, and Esther, I think we're looking to you for that one. I'm curious to hear
Well, the
that.
answer is no. And if you start a fat studies minor, you will be the first in the world, which is a wonderful thing. What you will find is, you know, there will be committees that may rate. This has to go through many committees, which is why it's really useful to have a senior faculty member like Dr. Brown spearhead this. If it comes from students, you know, it might take some years. But there will be people who realize you will attract undergraduates and grad students. You might even have faculty in a variety of departments choosing to come to Syracuse because of that. I speak because San Diego State University is the first in the world to have a women's studies department in 1969. And we were the second to have an LGBT studies program. The first in the country for that was Hobart and William Smith College in Geneva, New York. You know, their universities, you know, like to be considered leaders in certain fields. And of course, there will be pushback, but that happened with every single discipline you're in. Most universities in the Middle Ages started with classics and religion. So if you're not in classics and religion, I can assure you it was considered really, really radical at some point.
So there were some other questions bundled in there, but I don't remember what they were actually. So maybe you do.
I mean, so to answer the last question that was for me, I would say, you know, okay, so some of the most exciting parts about research, at least research documents, right, is kind of like the discussion section. You jump there and you're like, okay, what did you find? Why'd you find it? Where's your explanation around those things? Lit reviews are great. The first portion of the, you know, because it talks about all the things that have been done in the past. But I think that, you know, when we talk about critiquing articles and really looking at the meat of the study, the methodology section is always going to be the section that you go to, because the methodology section is going to be the section that parses out sample sizes, tests that were run, questions that were asked, etc. Like the literature review will help set up as to why they are framing the study the way that they are, but it's in the methods. And I think, you know, sometimes the methods can also be the hardest part of an article to understand and to read. And I think that's why a lot of people get caught up. So when you see something, and yes, it may be published, there's a lot of things that have gotten published in the past that people, you know, would find to be extremely problematic in today's society. But you got to go back and you got to read the methods. How did you do the study? Who did you recruit, right? You cannot generalize a study to everybody in society if you've only surveyed 100 people. And furthermore, when we talk about different genders, races, all of that stuff, none of those people are in your study. So how are you talking about that in the context of me, right? Or in the context of somebody else who you didn't even survey? right? And I think that when we start to talk about reading research, to me, those are the things that you fact check. Those are the things that you go back and read, because the abstract is the easy way out, right? I think we've all done that. Oh, the abstract, I read it. It's, 250 words. This looks like something I could use, grab it as a citation, put it somewhere else. But you're not really parsing out how they did the study, what the study is based on, because they can't tell you all of that stuff in the abstract. So that's one of the things that I would point to as really, you got to do that part, which takes a little bit more time to understand. But a lot of the things when we talk about, matters of weight loss and talk about weight stigma and all of those things, you find, where people fall short in the methods section. And so it's always good to kind of look at those things. And then I think that, to your point about having, own departments and different things like that, one of the things that I find about when we talk about weight stigma and we talk about fat phobia, it's very hard to talk about those things as though they exist by themselves. To me, fat phobia fits under the umbrella of racism sometimes. It fits under the umbrella of disability. It fits under or ableism, should I say. It fits under umbrellas of other concepts, other identities, right? Because the narratives about people and about their lived experiences change when fatness is entered into the conversation, right? And so the lived experience of somebody who is fat and disabled may be different than somebody who is fat and able. And so there's a way to kind of talk about those things and really, in some ways, probably partner with different departments. When we talk about African-American studies, can we talk about, the type of discrimination that Fannie Lou Hamer experienced because she was a fat Black disabled woman? We should talk about that, right? Versus a Rosa Parks, who was generally able-bodied. She was in a smaller body, but she was also light-skinned. So can we talk about colorism? Can we talk about all of those things? And I think that when we start to really look at the whole spectrum of how fat phobia functions in society with these other identities, you get a more rich field of study in a lot of ways.
To write the book that I published in 2015, Body of Truth, I spent a while looking at, I thought, I'm going to go look at the research on weight and health. I'm a journalist. I'm not a researcher. I don't have a PhD, but I'm going to teach myself how to read research, and I'm going to look at this. And I was actually shocked at how often the conclusion in the abstract was actually not borne out by the study itself, because when you look at the methodology and you realize, golly, this was a study of 7 people. How in the world can you generalize in this way? Or wait a minute, even I, a non-researcher, could see fallacies in the way things were being put together. And that's when I started reading research with a much more critical eye, and it was shocking to me, really shocking. So I think if everyone would learn to read research, that would actually be a very powerful thing. We have a question in the chat, which I'm going to read to you, from a professor here in another college at Syracuse University, Cha-Cha Hudson. She says, my research and teaching focus on improving fit for plus-size women's apparel. Syracuse University is one of the few schools with dress forms for sizes 6 to 24 plus. However, some people don't understand why our students are encouraged to make clothes for larger bodies. Do you feel that many people don't understand why you do the work you do? What responses have you gotten from your research and your book, Dr. Cox?
Short answer, yes. I think that there are a lot of people who don't understand why we do the work that we do. And oftentimes, when we talk about weight stigma and fat phobia, it is typically, in my experience, has been partnered with like attractiveness and, and cisgender rules around, or heterosexual, well, you could be more attractive to men, and like, you're not fat, you're beautiful. Like there's all of that, like, oh, fat people just want to feel good about themselves. So give them a hug, tell them that they matter, and like, let's move on. What people don't understand is that people are dying under weight stigma, and whether that's in the medical industry or whether that's just the way that people are being treated and there's less access to resources and things of that nature. So I do think that there are many people who don't understand why we do the work that we do. I also think that there are people who exist in bodies who are larger than 24, and I've seen the plus after that, but those people need clothes too, right? And it's important that we have clothes for those individuals. So why not teach students how to create clothing that actually works for people who live in larger bodies? I think we have to get past the point that larger does not mean round. When it comes to fit for clothes, we have curves and dips and slips and all of that jazz. And it would be extremely helpful to have clothes that actually fit us, that are, accessible to us to that point also. And then, as far as the responses that I've gotten from my research in my book, I mean, the biggest one is that I'm promoting obesity. I'm promoting, unhealthy lifestyles. My rhetoric is dangerous. The things that I say, and all of that stuff. But I think that, more meaningful responses that I've gotten from the book is that, I periodically get, emails from people that say, it's because of your book that, I've been able to kind of move forward. Your book has inspired me to do the things that I want to do in my own life. A lot of Black women email me and talk to me about their experiences. I've had people email me that used to be, their background is also in the church, in the way that the church kind of uses anti-fat rhetoric, and just talking about the ways in which my book has shed light on that for them and how it's helped them to kind of have a better understanding of the world around them. And then, some of the biggest thing so when I first wrote my book, and my mom called me. She said, well, she sent me a text and she said, I'm gonna call you later. And she said, I read the book. That was the text, right? And so I'm like, okay, like heart palpitations, like I had to go chase my heart down the street somewhere. And she's like, I read the book. And, and then to have a conversation with her about, the things that I experienced and how I read that as a child, those types of experiences that I had was super meaningful, and, she went to the doctor not too long ago and the doctor told her, well, you need to lose weight or whatever. And I wish my daughter said, I don't have to do that. Like, it's that type of stuff that really warms my heart in a lot of meaningful ways, that, the lived experiences of people are being opened up and people are understanding us in ways that they didn't before.
Okay, we've got a pair of questions in the chat that I think go together. So first one is from Amanda, who says, I'd like to ask about if there are any potential pitfalls for fat activism or things we should be careful about in terms of intersectionality and inclusion, keeping in mind there's a lot of variety of definitions of fatness as a social construct. And then Bill asks, can anyone speak on the variable of, quote, degree of fatness? In other words, can the experience of a 2X plus size woman be comparable to a 6X? Is this anything like the difference in blackness and lightness of skin color? So I think those questions kind of go together for whoever would like to address them.
Esther, I'm happy to defer to you first.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think you're raising some great questions. Obviously, these are all intersectional issues. One of the best ways to make sure that people are represented is to have people in the group who represent a variety of groups, right? So, fat studies has been criticized as being a very white cisgender field. So it's very important to have a representation. And of course, it matters, that there is more discrimination based on how fat people are. But I want to say that for women, that kicks in very early. And of course, you can even think about in the media where a size 6 or in acting might be seen as too fat. So you always have to look at the intersection of fat studies with gender and race and ethnicity and disability and and sexuality, and those are fascinating issues. And I think now more and more students are beginning to do that. I just want to add, in terms of the discussion about has anybody ever criticized us, academia is a field where you have to have a thick skin. I always say you have to have a skin of a grapefruit and not the skin of a peach. You will get your articles rejected no matter what mainstream field you're in. You will get grant proposals rejected. You will have students in teaching evaluations tell you you're missing topics, but those are all learning experiences, and they do bring the field forward.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback on that. I think, and I'm okay. Like, I'm for critiquing as long as it's constructive, right? Like, I think that, when we critique one another and we are constructively doing it, it helps us to be better, which I think kind of leads into the question about the potential pitfalls for fat activism, right? We need somebody, or we need each other as a community to be able to come together and say, hey, we're missing something over here. Hey, somebody's not being included over there, right? And how can we bring those things together? And sure, there's a lot of rarity as it relates to the definitions of fatness as a social construct, but I also think that there's a lot of, it's the same thing as it relates to race, right? So race in and of itself is also a social construct, right? But where we get into issues, at least for me, as it relates to fat phobia and weight stigma, is the laws, the rules, and the policies are only really geared towards people in certain bodies. So there is that individual experience that you have, right? Where you might be a size 12 and you grew up and your family called you fat, and there's some internalization around weight stigma as it relates to those things. But we can also acknowledge that while saying there are other structural rules and policies put in place for people who live in larger bodies. And I think that there's a way to kind of have a conversation about the ways that fat phobia and weight stigma impact us all on those levels, right? But not all in the same degree, right? So I don't think it's a matter of like picking and choosing. It's a matter of better understanding how weight stigma operates in society, because it's the same way that, racism and white privilege in some ways operates in society, is that it's a double-edged sword. Now, people of other races get more brunt of the harm, right? But it doesn't leave white people unscathed, right? And so weight stigma and fat phobia doesn't leave smaller people unscathed, right? There are people who have dedicated their whole lives to living in a smaller body because of internalized weight stigma, although they may still be in a smaller body right now, as opposed to the very forward in your face type of treatment that people of larger bodies receive as it relates to the rejection of health insurance, and the things that get said to them, or the treatment that they get at the doctor's office, and things of that nature. And then I think, to Bill's point, or to Bill's question, I think that there can be some overlap as it relates to the experiences of people who we call in the fat community smaller fats, right? So smaller fats versus infini fats, so people who live in larger bodies. I think that there could be some overlap, right? But then there's going to come a point to where, there are unique experiences that 6X people have that are theirs, and theirs alone, right? The same way as you look at somebody in your example, you kind of talk about colorism. As a dark-skinned Black individual, right? And I understand what that means, being within the Black community. Like, I'm not dark-skinned, right? But to other people who live in my community or in my collective, like, they have experiences that I would never be able to kind of, that I've never experienced. I've never been called a tar baby. I don't know what that is. Like, you know what I mean? I don't know what that experience is. And I think that it's the same type of situation when you talk about people who live in larger bodies. So some overlapping, but experiences that are unique to your own. Yeah, so I'll just stop there.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat. So going back to the idea that if this degree of fatness matters, right? If it's different, if your lived experience is going to be different if you're 1X versus 6X. How can we measure it for research without relying on problematic measures like BMI? That's a big question.
Well, I can add to that. It is interesting that we tend to like categories. We compare women to men, even though there are people who might be genderqueer, et cetera. And so when it comes to something that is on a continuum, like weight, or, we could actually just look at what is the relationship or correlation as people are fatter or thinner. And in the NAFA study, I want to just give a shout out to Bill Fabry here, who is here commenting, who founded NAFA, a great example of how activism has helped, thanks to NAFA, and groups like that. We now have such a thing as fat studies. But in the NAFA study, people varied a lot on weight, and definitely we saw a difference, and not only a difference, but again, it was a gender difference as well. Women who weighed just a little bit over, sort of whatever average BMI was, were getting fat phobic comments. For men, they had to weigh quite a bit more. Let me just use an analogy. Some of you may know who Chris Christie is. He ran for governor in New Jersey, very fat man. He gets a lot of fat phobic comments, but Hillary Clinton, not quite as fat as he is, gets a lot of fat phobic comments. And that's a great example of, you look at the intersection of gender and weight. But yeah, there are, there's a lot of research now on really interesting research methods to look at issues that are not the standard sort of statistics. And certainly BMI has a lot of problems.
And to add to that, I say, go back to the community. The community knows how to define themselves better than anybody else. And they understand the nuance between how they see themselves and how other people see themselves. And so, for me, I think that, taking the BMI off the table, it doesn't leave you without answers, right? But it allows you to kind of go back to a space where it's being defined by the people and not by institutions, not by, structures of power and all of that stuff.
And I would just add to that I know that there are researchers working on alternates to BMI, or there were a few years ago. I don't know who's working on what right now, but I think one of the issues is that, BMI is just a calculation. You can know someone's height and weight and calculate BMI. I think other measures that might be more scientifically accurate to measure differences are more complex, perhaps more invasive. They require, it's not so easy as just give me your height and weight and we'll calculate it out. So, and my understanding about BMI is that researchers like it because you can go back to earlier studies where perhaps there was self-reporting of height and weight, and you can sort of calculate out BMI and draw all kinds of conclusions from those. So, accurate or not, but it's easy to sort of apply it. Do we have any other questions? Don't be shy if you do. Okay, here is a question, which, yes, I think this is appropriate to ask. This person was not sure. I'm wondering about how to best navigate publishing as a junior scholar. Dr. Rothblum, do you prefer researchers to reach out to you first before submitting a manuscript, or what's the expected process?
Oh, great question. I love to talk about publishing. First of all, journal editors like to see things in writing. They don't want you to call or something like that. So when somebody tells me in one sentence what their study is about or their project, it says, would you publish this? I really can't tell. It is important to, if it's really, really inappropriate, I would say that. But the best thing is to actually submit an article. And if it's not appropriate for my journal, it would be possibly for someone else. But I love people to contact me and offer to be reviewers. That way, first of all, if you're a student, you can put it on your CV as editorial experience, guest editor, Fat Studies Journal, etc. I would need 2 or 3 areas. So I need to know, are you in nutrition versus popular culture versus, French literature, so that when I get an article, I can send it to you. And it's a great way to see what it's like to be evaluating somebody else's published article. But yeah, I hope that, I assume that if you wrote maybe a couple of paragraphs to a potential editor, they might answer you, but they may just say, please submit the article and, we'll send it out for review.
Thank you for that. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Mhm.
So I wondered if you guys could speak to teaching about fatness in the classroom and what kind of approaches you use when approaching. So obviously, we're here because we're pro fat studies, but in the classroom, it's a little different. It's concepts that are really new to a lot of students. And I especially wondered if you could speak to doing so in a fat body, which often feels really vulnerable when, surrounded by a bunch of mostly teen, 20-year-old students who maybe have very hostile views about some of these issues.
Right. Well, I can start by saying, when I showed you the slides by Susan Brownmiller, where she's looking at how women have been portrayed throughout history and across cultures, I find that I can ask students, about their reactions to that, and they sort of then get it, that weight is sort of our current preoccupation. It might have been, wearing corsets or many other practices in the past. I also want to say there's a book called The Fat Pedagogy Reader that I would recommend to anybody teaching fat studies. But yeah, it's a controversial field, and students will tell me, well, they're nutrition majors or dietetics majors, and this is very different from what they're being taught in other classes. And again, that is what academia is about. But you're absolutely right. It is very difficult to teach about any kind of critical studies when you are a member of that group. And which, by the way, means that for people who are allies, who are thin allies, for example, it is very important to bring up these issues because you may get a lot less pushback. I often do workshops with a friend of mine who is a thin, white medical doctor and very fat affirmative. And so if she did this by herself, people would say, well, what do you know? You're a thin woman. And if I did it alone, they'd say, well, what do you know? You're an angry fat woman. So together we kind of balance each other out. And that might be a strategy, even if you're a guest, to have a guest lecture come in where one is thin and one is fat, just as an idea.
Good idea.
Oh, can
Go
I?
ahead.
Okay. I was going to say, I've had the pleasure of teaching medical students and also walking through some of the what do they do? Like they do the scenarios, and then you spend 2 hours with them afterwards, kind of breaking down ideas and thoughts. And then Rutgers, so previously to working at Med, I worked at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School. And so they actually have a health equity and social justice track where I assisted in some ways on helping to build the curriculum around weight stigma. And so one of the things that I started to do towards, after the pandemic, everybody's coming back, you're talking to medical students who are in their first and second year of training or education. I started putting like trigger warnings on my presentations. And when I put the trigger warning on my presentation, I'd say, there's going to be some things that you hear that you're going to have a knee-jerk reaction to reject, right? But the hope is that you don't do that, that you kind of sit with that, the discomfort, and we're going to work through it. And then I also kind of outlined that, we understand that we live in structures of power, and these are certain ways that people do this, and this is not an indictment against you, right? I think that when we start talking about the lived experiences that fat people have, people tend to take that very personally. And sometimes they are not able to separate themselves from what you're saying about society as a whole. And I think it's the same thing when you're talking about other marginalized groups and the lived experiences that they've had. And what I've learned from doing that kind of helps to bring down the defensiveness before it starts, right? And then I can kind of go on with my presentation and share some, share some information. And then I also share my own experiences, which in some ways could either be good or bad. I mean, it could always backfire, but it's hard to dispute somebody's lived experience. I'm always mindful of something that Michelle Obama said in her book. And she said, it's hard for people to hate you up close. And so oftentimes there's a lot of talk about the disdain for fat and the disdain for fatness and what that means and what, these people are wasting their lives away and they don't care about themselves, right? But like pulling a line from like elementary school is like, say it to my face, right? So you kind of have that notion where people start to kind of really think a little bit more about the judgments that they make about people and the bodies that they have. And so those things have worked well for me. When it comes to teaching other things like research methods and stuff, I've also used, I've kind of used myself as a way of talking about methodology and different things like that, right? Like, so, and so I think there are ways to kind of slip those things in, but also ways to make everybody kind of feel a little bit more comfortable about the information that you're going to present, understanding that really all that they've known is anti-fat rhetoric, right? And so you are sharing something with them that may be fairly new, that may be shocking, that may cause that reaction, negative reactions.
Especially when you're talking about anyone in the health professions, right? So actually a project that I'm working on right now is trying to create curricula for various kinds of health professionals, weight stigma. So Joy, I'm super interested in seeing what was done at Rutgers, if you wouldn't mind sharing it with me.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, great. Esther, are there plans for a second edition of the Fat Studies Reader? Someone wants to know.
Yeah, somebody recently asked me that. I think the answer is no. And you know why? The field is way too big. We would need probably 10 volumes now. When I started the Fat Studies Journal, which by the way, the acquisition editor of Taylor and Francis Routledge asked me to do it. I said, well, what if I did one issue a year? Because I just didn't think there were enough people. You need articles when you're doing a new journal. And she said, well, their minimum was 2 issues a year. So that's what I went with. Now we could easily do 4 issues a year. We've been there for 12 years. I probably have enough articles for 2 or 3 years. So that's the answer. The field is huge. And so, I think that probably what I would recommend is just to, just scan the literature in your area, in your discipline, and you will see there are articles on fat studies. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks to everyone for coming, and thank you both, Esther and Joy, for an amazing presentation, questions, and being here. It's been really fabulous to have you. So yeah, thanks everyone. This concludes our second seminar, and hopefully we will have a third in the future. Take care.